Good evening, everybody. My name is Ilan Stavans. I am a professor here at Amherst College and also the host of the NEPR podcast, In Contrast. And it is wonderful to see you all here, and it is a pleasure to have Bret Stephens here with me. I will introduce him in a second. I want to give you a sense of what this series is about, the protocol for tonight, and then proceed to the conversation. The November 8 election was a shock, that is putting it mildly, for many of us, and particularly for some of us who are in the academic environment. It felt as if we were more distant, more remote, and fractured in connection or disconnection with the country that we sit in than ever, and that there were many voices, many ideological voices, many ethnic and class and gender voices that we don't hear on campus, because campus can be turned often into a kind of echo chamber. As a result of this, an initiative began here at Amherst to contemplate the possibility of creating a series, a course, a series of related events where different viewpoints could be brought together, and a dialogue would be established, particularly at the ideological and political level. And I was thrilled with this idea. I signed up immediately. And the result is a course that I'm teaching right now called Point, Counterpoint, that attempts to understand the phenomenon of the Trump presidency, the Trump administration, maybe even the Trump regime. The word has been used once or twice in conversations that Bret and I have been having, in a way that is truly in dialogue, dialectical, and that pays attention to the other side. We fail very often in campuses to hear the other side, to humanize the other side, to recognize that the other side has a clear, intelligent, wise, and important argument, and that ours is not the only one. In connection with the course, there are 4 distinguished speakers that are coming to campus. The first one came last week, Wellesley Lowry, a Pulitzer Prize winner journalist for the Washington Post, who broke the story of Ferguson nationally and has followed the movement of Black Lives Matter since then, wrote a terrific book called You Can't Kill Us All. He was here with me last week. Today we have Bret, and we are going to also have a foreign correspondent for The New Yorker, Robin Wright, coming on October 12th. All of you are invited. And after that, we have William Crystal, who is the founding editor of the Weekly Standard and a very prominent conservative voice nationwide. We are also going to have an event throughout the second part of November devoted to immigration, in which non-Amherst College, yet Amherst town people are going to come and at Holden Theater tell their story as DACA and other immigrants to the rest of us. Amherst is not a balloon, it's not a bubble, it sits in a town that has real people, that have real passions in life stories, and they will come to us and we will go to them. I want to stress that the spirit of the course and the spirit of this series is one of tolerance and respect and interest in the other side, and that you are likely to hear today points of view with which you might disagree. And needless to say, the purpose of a liberal arts education is precisely, if you're a student, to get you exposed to those points of views. You will do with them whatever you want to do. You might embrace them, you might reject them, you might refine your viewpoint. that is up to you, but we would fail as teachers if we only gave you our own voices. In the spirit of that tolerance and that respect and that civic and civil engagement, I ask you to please listen to everything that is going to be said. Bret and I are going to be speaking for about maybe 25 to 30 minutes, and after that, we are going to open it to the audience. There is a microphone here to my left. People are invited to stand online and make a question or offer a question, and I'm sure Bret is going to be interested and ready to answer it. This is also being taped for the FBI. No. This is for our own records. It's going to be posted on the Amherst webpage, and I want to thank my friends of communications and of IT for coming and preparing all of this. I want to thank the Amherst books folks who have Bret's book available. He is ready to sign books after the event. And I finally want to thank the two donors, class of 1970, who offered very graciously the money in order to be able to bring all these distinguished guests from the outside. Bret Stephens is a distinguished political opinion writer whose columns appear in the New York Times twice a week, on Thursdays, as it did today, and on Saturdays. He has been working for the New York Times up at page since 2016.
No, since April.
Since April, even less. He was the editor of the Jerusalem Post, and after that he worked for the Wall Street Journal. He grew up, he was born in the United States, but grew up in Mexico and is a Mexican Jew. And I'm happy to say this because I don't find Mexican Jews like me very often, and it is likely to become at some point part of the conversation. And went to the University of Chicago, where he did his undergraduate, and after that he went to the London School of Economics for a master's. In an essay speech that was published in the New York Times, an essay speech that he delivered upon accepting a prize in Australia, he talks about his time at the University of Chicago, why he went there, and how that education changed him. Before I ask my first question, I want to say one more thing. Bret kindly agreed to arrive very early today, and he has been in my class where he talked to my students, and after that he has been in a conversation with me on NPR in the In Contrast show. So on occasion, you might hear during our dialogue, one of us saying, as I was telling you before, or in connection with something that we have explored. We are going to try to create this not as a solipsistic dialogue only for us, but we will make references to something that might have happened before, and we'll bring all the audience in. Finally, the topic of the course is Trump, and so is the topic of the series, but the topic of life, in spite of Trump, is life itself. So we are going to be talking about all sorts of other things. For instance, Bret, campuses. Mm-hmm. What is wrong with campuses today?
Well, campuses are lovely. I mean, as we were walking through Amherst, I was just thinking about what a dream this is. It's La vida es un sueño at Amherst College. So, look, I feel a little bit reluctant to offer grand statements about campuses because I know that whenever people make grand statements about American journalism, what they perceive and what I experience are two very different things. But I suspect what you're getting at is the question of the politics of campus life as they've unfolded, at least in public, over the past year or so. And what the rest of the world perceives this may be different from what you experience, but what the rest of the world perceives are highly insular islands of privileged young people who are failing to recognize just how privileged they are, who are engaged in a politics that is often illiberal, in attempting to shut down voices and ideas with which they disagree. Young students who, in the parlance of the Trumpkins, have become snowflakes, melting under the heat of an opinion they dislike, claiming that somehow speech is tantamount to violence, and running the risk of a kind of permanent infantilization because everyone is so desperate to protect their feelings. I was on a show the other day with the Bill Maher show with Salman Rushdie, who made a wonderful point. He said colleges should be safe spaces for thought, not from thought. And again, I don't know whether this is true of Amherst, but I think there is more than a grain of truth to that observation.
How did we get here? I don't want to debate it from within the college. I'm interested in your point of view from outside. Colleges have been strongholds of rebellion and activism for at least 30, 40, 50 years. Our conversation right now coincides with the Ken Burns series on PBS, and many have been hooked to it and to the granular aspects of not only the foreign front but the home front, and how dramatic it was from Kent State to Oberlin to Columbia to Berkeley, the resistance. In many ways, you and I were talking about this today, college is the time for rebellion. College is the time to get the demons out. But how have we gotten to this?
Not all rebelliousness is about demons. A lot of it is very productive. Look, conservatives especially often draw these threads of connection between the 60s and the colleges of the late 1960s. Black Panthers taking over, Cornell and so on, and the Black Lives Matter movement present. I'm not sure that analogy entirely works for a number of reasons. I mean, for one thing, at least in the 1960s, college students were for free speech, not against it. And that's an important distinction. The second thing is, I think college students back then were much more personally invested in the politics of their time because, at least among young men, there was a very good chance of being drafted to a war in which they did not want to serve for reasons which were certainly understandable, if not entirely defensible. Whereas I don't think anyone here is at risk of being drafted into anything. And so there is a kind of, there was a sincerity, I think. Of course, I was born in 1973, so what the hell do I know? But there was a sincerity that about politics there, whereas I think to some extent politics today is based on kind of histrionics. I mean, everyone here is a member of the resistance. I mean, Lord, I'm a member of the resistance. But what are we resisting exactly, other than being very angry and upset that this as my mother would say, this Oloch, has become president, this Schlemiel. It's not as if, the truth is, most of you, I suspect, if I had to place a bet, the Trump administration will not affect your life at all. You guys are fine. Now, I know everyone will go, no, and hiss and boo, but it's probably true. So I'm not saying, look, when you were talking earlier about the series, and I was thinking Trump point and counterpoint, where are the actual Trump supporters in your list of invitees? I mean, I'm probably the leading never-Trumper in the country, or one of them. But there's an aspect, I think, of modern political life that is a little bit divorced from the reality that most students who express these views actually have in their own lives. And I offer this by way of saying something to make you slightly uncomfortable and get you to dislike me, because that's what I'm here to do.
Yeah. Since we're in the topic of campuses, and I will return to it later on, you wrote maybe a couple of weeks ago a piece on Title IX.
Yeah.
And I'd like to get from you the sense of what your views are on Betsy DeVos's approach to dismantling some of the policies of the Obama administration connected with Title IX. Where do you think campuses got it right? And where do you think campuses got it absolutely wrong?
Well, again, you know, you're asking me a question that's slightly outside of my lane, because I don't sort of inhabit a campus and live its politics.
But you write about this.
I write 108 columns a year, among other things. So I wrote a couple of campus columns, 104 columns. Look, Americans care about two things. We care about justice, and we care about due process. And we recognize that the two are entwined, but also in some tension with one another. We should care very deeply about the reality that women on campuses are being harassed, sexually assaulted, and raped, and that's very serious. My perception is that this, of course, is a time-old problem, but it has been fueled by a culture of binge drinking that seems to be of a piece with this. And I don't know why people who talk about this don't say, these kids are under the age of 21. Take away the liquor. You know, don't do something to make sure that everyone, male as well as female, isn't you know, drop down drunk, you know, and in these situations. So that's one aspect of it. Now, with respect to Title IX, look, if you've been following the journalism of Emily Yoffe in Slate and The Atlantic, the reality is that the Dear Colleague letters of 2011 that the Department of Education sent to campuses was a well-intentioned effort to create a set of regulations and expectations that would facilitate the effort by campuses to get rid of usually, but not always, young men accused of sexual assault or rape. The problem is that bringing the standard down to essentially a 50% plus one standard of evidence, which is the same standard in civil cases, is it likelier true than not, risked in too many cases permanently tarring the accused with an accusation that would stay with them for the rest of their lives, whether it was true or not. And rape is too serious of an allegation to have that on your record for the rest of it. It's a life-changing event. So there's a reason why the standard of evidence should be reasonably high, because I hope every progressive or liberal in this room thinks that you would rather let guilty men go free than put an innocent man in jail, right? I mean, all of you who are against the death penalty, and I assume that's most of you, think, you know, sure, most of the people who are on death row probably committed murders, but if there's one guy there who didn't commit that murder, that's a reason to really think very hard about the morality of the death penalty. So something similar happens, of course, in terms of the way in which these tribunals are shaped, where basic constitutional protections that we expect in courts of law aren't afforded the accused when it comes to facing your accuser, being able to defend yourself, having counsel, and so on. And that ought to concern us. Now, I wrote a column, and I think my view is right. A young woman I know, wrote me a long letter afterwards to tell me of her experience of being raped in college. And it was such a powerful letter that I thought that the best thing I could do as a columnist in the spirit of believing in disagreement was simply, with a short preface, to run her entire letter.
With her permission.
With her permission, without her name, because the letter spoke for itself. And the reality is there are two powerful sides on this issue. There's not people who care about justice and seeing justice done against rapists or people guilty of sexual assault should care for due process, and those of us who care for due process should also care that that campuses should not be an environment in which young men can engage in predatory behavior and get away with it. And that's how you go about making that happen, I think, is more of a question for you than for me. Yeah. These are realities that we have to address, and we have to say it's not one or the other.
There's a lot there, and I want to move on, and I'm sure we can come back should questions arise. But I want to understand something that you said in passing. Are you suggesting that there is a possibility, and even there should be a motion to take the alcohol out of campuses?
Last I checked, the drinking age was 21. Last I checked, most freshmen and sophomores and even juniors are not 21 years of age. Now, maybe because you and I grew up in Latin America, I started drinking wine as a normal thing when I was 13 years old. Mm. So when I became an adolescent, like the idea of like having a drink wasn't this like fantastic thought. It was like, well, if you have fish for dinner, you have white wine, and it was normal, right? And I think I got very drunk once in college, and I felt embarrassed. All I did was throw up on myself, and that was that. And then I thought, God, that's a bad experience. I don't want to do that again. But again, it was the University of Chicago. It's where fun goes to die. So
I'm glad you said it.
So my colleague Ross Douthat, a very, very smart guy, said actually we should lower the drinking age to 16.
I was going to suggest
so that by the time students get to college, it's not this big deal like, oh, we can go and party, and partying means getting, excuse my language, shit-faced.
I want to go to that wonderful speech that you delivered in Australia, where you make a plea, an argument for dissent. Dissent is the duty of the skeptic and the invitation to open, engaging, and dialectical dialogue. This is something that you and I talked before during the NPR conversation, but I really want to bring this back. The idol that you often talk about is Socrates, and I'm an admirer of Socrates as I am, and getting his perspective from everybody except for Socrates himself, who didn't leave us anything of his own, and thus we only gather what others made of him rather than what he made of himself, is the idea that he was tempting the Athenian youth, and that it was his capacity to always question and question that you question that made him so endearing, but also so dangerous. So the question that I asked you before, and I'd like you to come back, but I'd like you to come back in a different way, Bret, and that is, it's the question of how, is there a limit to dissent? You were talking about campuses. Is there a limit to how far our skepticism should go? And I was struck by the moment I asked you the question about Title IX, and you said, I'm not a specialist. I write all these columns. And it is a question that we on campuses ask ourselves as faculty. What is the difference between a generalist and a particularist? What do you know when you know very little? And how much can you know when you know a lot, but you don't know in a concentrated way? So you end up writing about all sorts of things, but you don't end up writing about one thing that you have ended up taking a property of. How much is doubt a danger, skepticism, and how much is doubt a responsibility?
That's a large question. Look, the purpose of having a generalist and being a generalist is that even if you never specialize, you never become an expert in 17th century Spanish literature or whatever it is, by casting your mind and sort of looking at various problems, you are able to perhaps analogize and think broadly and bring a broad perspective onto particular problems. And there's some, I think, intellectual value that the generalist brings to problems about which he doesn't know every minute detail. Because sometimes wisdom actually isn't found in the granular picture as seen through the electron microscope. It's found in a broader picture of saying, well, what is this all about? Now, on the question of doubt, look, I've always felt that the healthy human beings maintain some kind of inner tension within their souls between self-confidence and self-doubt. That people we admire aren't so self-confident as to be insufferable, right? So sure of themselves, and not so self-doubting as to be, neurotic and incapable of offering, a view. So there's this kind of inner strain within the intelligent man or intelligent woman's soul that is pushing them in both directions, and it's within that tension that we find productive thinking, right? Just take the act of writing. What is writing? Writing is just sheer nerve. 90% of writing is just working up the nerve to put that first sentence on the page. And the people you asked me earlier today, well, how do you do it? Well, I just work up the nerve to do it. That's kind of it. And after you've done it for a while, it becomes a little easier. But even now, I think, oh my gosh, 2 million people are going to look at this piece, and someone is going to object to a semicolon, and it'll be an issue. That Stevens idiot doesn't know how to use a semicolon. Look, I generally think that societies are very well served by gadflies, and societies that encourage gadflies are societies that tend to thrive. I can think of no successful society that has discouraged or suppressed the independent thinker. Because even if 100 gadflies are just nuisances, one of them is going to be Steve Jobs. One of them is going to be the iconoclast and the pathbreaker whose willingness to cut against the grain is the engine of social and scientific and moral progress and so on. And when you think, who are the people who are the change makers in our society? Was Rosa Parks a person who agreed or disagreed? She disagreed. That's what Rosa Parks did. She said, no, I will not sit there in the back of the bus. I will sit here, right? She was a disagreeer. Right? You think of the kind of famous dissenters, whether it's Mandela or Liu Xiaobo, who just passed away, or Natan Sharansky, or one guy, one man or woman or another. They're all people who said no. And one of the things, just to go back to your earlier question, how many people on campus are really saying no? And one thing is, my views on Trump are well known, right? But if there's someone in this audience who likes Trump, points for gumption, right? Points for just having the nerve to say, no, you know what? Make America great again. In fact, I'd be willing to sit here and give you the pro-Trump argument, because I think one thing an audience like this is desperate to hear is an intelligent case for this buffoon, right? And it needs to be made because, believe it or not, it wasn't just morons who voted for Trump. There are people, I know them, smart people, who voted for Trump with intelligence. And by the way, not because they're bigoted or they aren't offended by all of Trump's comments about Muslims, women, and so on, but they made a calculated decision that was not simply stupid, that this guy was the better option. And people ought to hear that. I always admire someone who's just willing to just be hugely unfashionable, whether it's in their clothing or their politics.
Going back to the issue of campuses and going back to the issue of any institution, the New York Times, your pieces are published in the New York Times. We are here in an auditorium of Amherst College. Don't institutions end up, I'm playing the devil's advocate here, although I hope you sense a dissenting tone. Institutions end up shaping conformity, even when when we say no, we say it in the context of four walls where we are applauding you for saying no. You're not going out and standing up like Rosa Parks or like Steve Jobs. When you are within an institution, you end up doing that.
You should have seen the reaction to my first column at the New York Times.
Which was?
At the climate change column. And 45,000 people signing a change.org petition to have me fired.
Which brings me to the question.
Which, as far as I'm concerned, was better than winning a Pulitzer Prize.
Do you read the comments that people write?
Sure, absolutely.
All of them?
Yeah.
And?
It energizes me.
To continue having the same approach.
Look, I mean, I read them kind of in lurid fascination. I mean, a lot of people who write comments, and I hope I'm not offending someone in the audience. Actually, I hope I am. You know, are people clearly with way too much time on their hands? Because what sort of loser reads op-eds in the Times and then goes on the comment section? It's like, you know, Stevens, you know, and you're like, but I still read them. Sorry.
And you read them out of this narcissism, ego. Look at everybody's writing. 45,000 people are writing about Stevens and climate change.
Well, 45,000 people just checked the box on a
oh, okay.
petition. Look, it's just very hard. Very few of you have ever walked past a mirror and not looked. The comments are a little bit like that. You're like, I look like that? To this guy? So that's part of it.
Does it shape the next column?
No. No. I'm very conscious that I'm not bidding for reader popularity.
So in what sense are your columns statements disengaged really from the community of readers that you have? And in what sense are they invitations to dialogue?
Well, I hope they're invitations to dialogue. Look, my wife is a liberal. Right. Actually, she's worse. She's a social democrat because she's German, although she just voted for Angela Merkel, to her own astonishment. And I think that a good column is a column where she'll say, I don't entirely agree, but good column, I see that. And I think that if that's the spot I'm hitting...
Is she your first reader? She's the reader that you're targeting?
She's the reader I'm targeting. She's not always my first reader, but you know, she's near the top. I guess after my editor, she'll read it. And when I feel like, the point is, I'm writing a column self-consciously not towards the chorus of conservatives who are going to say, yeah, Stevens, sock it to the liberals. I'm trying to write to the intelligent person on the other side who will say, okay, you know, I didn't know that. I'm going to have to think about what you said. And I think if I do that, then that's kind of cool. That's satisfaction enough. I mean, look, the Times hired me, I think, because after the election, one of the shocks of the election was the realization, oh my God, there's this other country. And, you know, I had a conversation with Mr. Sulzberger when he hired me, and he said, well, what are your concerns? I said, look, here's my concern. You love me now because I'm the never Trumper at the Wall Street Journal, and everyone thinks I'm so courageous for going against Trump. It's actually the least courageous thing I've ever done is point out that Trump is a schmuck. But I said, you know, you like me because you agree with me on Trump. And then you're going to wake up and discover that, oh my goodness, Stevens is actually pretty conservative on a number of issues. And he said something which I thought was so intelligent and so winning. He said, I want to hire you not because of your never Trumpism, but almost in spite of it, which was that the family realized that the New York Times, to be a truly national paper, needed to enlarge the breadth of its commentary and not tailor itself, if you will, to the sensibility of the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And I think that was a courageous decision by the family, by the publishers, and it was the right decision. I mean, there's this Arthur Miller cliche, like all Arthur Miller statements, you know, about a newspaper being a country in conversation with itself. But I think there's some validity to that thought. And a paper that's as great as the Times should encourage a kind of cacophony. I mean, this is what I was getting at in my Australia speech. You cannot begin to understand, or you cannot begin to disagree until you have truly understood. So make an effort to understand the other person's point of view. And not enough, I think not enough of that is happening on campuses. It's not happening in our echo chambers on Fox News, if that's what you watch, or on MSNBC. By the way, I'm now a contributor to MSNBC. And maybe liberals, maybe Hillary would have won the election if her universe hadn't simply been the echo chamber of, oh gosh, Trump is so awful, he's a phobe, an ist, a this, a that, he can't possibly win. If she had been more awake to where the country really was, she would have run a different campaign that understood that places like Wisconsin and Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan weren't simply in her pocket.
You were a registered Republican.
Yeah.
And you are an independent now.
Now, yeah.
When and why the change?
Trump. Look, I mean, it wasn't so just Trump. It was watching my fellow conservatives find excuses for his politics, which I thought were pathetic. Look, I mean, there are people who support Trump because they think trade is bad, because they think immigrants are stealing our jobs, because they think that this country's going to hell and Hillary's corrupt. And God bless those people because they hold those views sincerely, right? But then there's Paul Ryan, right, who thinks that free trade is a great idea and thinks that immigration enriches the country and has all these views that used to be the Republican Party, orthodoxies. And just yesterday or today on Sean Hannity, he's praising Trump to the skies. What a great leader he is, right? So he's whoring himself to Sean Hannity. And I can't respect that because it's an obvious, it comes from a place of such complete lack of character and integrity. And one thing that I believe in as a conservative is that character is defining, that integrity is defining. And one of the reasons I never liked Bill Clinton was the character issue. In fact, I think Bill Clinton did a lot to pave the way for Donald Trump in his own way. So if character is a big issue, and if it's the idea that your moral nature matters and matters in acts of statesmanship, then how can any thoughtful conservative support a man with such evidently bad character? They can't. So I just found myself looking at one conservative I knew, one conservative, quote, intellectual after another, and just thinking, it's that line from A Man for All Seasons, but for whales. You're selling your soul for this guy, right? How can you do that? So it wasn't just a question of not liking Trump. It was a sense that conservatives I thought I knew, and people in the Republican Party I thought I knew were behaving atrociously.
Do you think this pooling, and it has been put to the fore in a number of forums, Bret, do you think this pooling of the conservative view, but particularly of the various wings within the Republican Party, actually truly represent a threat to the party itself that would break in the near future?
Yeah, I think we have actually 3 parties in this country, and we might soon have 4. The truth is the Republican Party is a shell organization in which half the party is a Trumpkin party, and then, or more than half perhaps, and then the rest are kind of the old line Jeb Bush style kind of conservatives. And I think that fissure is going to become more and more obvious.
And do you think this is an invitation truly to a future where there is not a bipartisan but a multi-partisan approach to American politics the way it exists in other parts of the world? Or if this is a fracture that would eventually reconfigure itself to a bipolar landscape again?
Look, because of the Electoral College, American politics tend to be bipolar. There are third parties now and then, but by and large, those fissures are relatively rare. The system wants to be bipolar. That's just the way first past the, political scientists don't need an explanation. But here's my fantasy, and one I've been entertaining for a few weeks. If you could get guys like Ben Sasse, one of the few honorable Republicans, and a guy like Michael Bennet, Colorado, middle-of-the-road Democrat, and a few other people to form even 7 or 8 Susan Collins type, even Tim Kaine maybe, but at any rate, 7 or 8 moderate, 3 or 4 moderate Republicans, 3 or 4 moderate Democrats to form a caucus within the Senate. That caucus can run the Senate because nothing is going to get past them. And it can be a force for remoderating a system that otherwise is spinning into increasingly extreme directions. And if that could accrete power and influence, you could imagine that becoming a force that conceivably could be something new in American politics. I mean, I'm engaging in a kind of Walter Mitty fantasy here, but that's what I hope. One scenario that in a better world is going to unfold. The alternative is that the Republican Party will become the Trumpkin Party, a nativist party, and the Democratic Party, in a kind of political version of an allergic fit, is going to go Bernie and going to go very hard left wing. And I think that's going to be a tragedy for American politics. You want middle-of-the-road conservative party. You want a middle-of-the-road liberal party. That's what makes for healthy politics.
I asked you this earlier today, but I think it fits here well, and maybe you can take it further. Bret, do you think that Trump is a disruptor that is an exception in American political history, or is he a disruptor that is a new beginning, and that after him we're not going back to what we had before, but we will have different types of disruptions or models that are no longer fitting into the previous pattern?
As the Danish physicist Niels Bohr supposedly said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. It's funny when you think of the joke that from the Soviet Union that under socialism the past can never be predicted. Anyway, that's so. I mean, the answer is A, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested in the second answer.
Okay, B, if I had to place a small bet, I would think it is.
That it is?
Yes, I think it is. Trump, this is a point I've made elsewhere, but it's kind of amazing that the stupidest man ever to be president has raised the deepest political questions and even philosophical questions we've faced since maybe the 1850s. Fundamental questions about the nature of the American Republic and of the fabric of our constitutional regime. He has surfaced political categories that we think apply only to countries like Venezuela or Turkey. What is demagoguery and how does the demagogue operate? Just take something like Twitter. Twitter is the ideal tool for demagogues because it restores what the demagogue used to have, which was the crowd. Elias Canetti, now forgotten but Nobel Prize winning writer, wrote a whole book about the nature of crowds. And we thought we had sort of moved beyond crowd politics, I don't know, the last generation or so. But Trump has, through Twitter, created the Twitter version of crowd politics, in which the mass feels that the man in the mass or the woman in the mass feels that he or she has a direct communication with the leader. Because the leader is tweeting not to everyone, he's tweeting to you. He's tweeting that the lying fake news media is at it again, or whatever. And you're like, yeah, Donald. So I think we're embarking on a new era of politics in which, partly on account of new technologies, but also because of the resurfacing of kind of forgotten forms of politics, we're going to see this play out more often and with greater ferocity. I mean, one of the things that I've said about Trump is thank God he's a buffoon, right? Because his buffoonery is easy to mock. And even then, some large proportion of Americans think he's just phenomenal, right? But what happens when you get smart Trump? What happens when you get coy, clever, Trump? Then you're really going to be in for it. Because then you're not just going to be simply dealing with the sort of weird, almost animal genius or animal cunning of Donald Trump, but an altogether, more ferocious intelligence that can learn from what Trump has already shown is possible, right, and take it a step further.
I want to ask you two more questions, and then we open it to the audience so that people can start lining up. The first one has to do with a column that you published today in the Times that is about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I have a first question that I want you to embed in some way in your answer, because that's not the main question, Bret. In the first question,
I love these meta questions.
Yeah. I love the way that in that piece you're playing with the sarcasm and irony and a double level of what you believe and you don't believe. And one of the things that I seem to register, and I'm interested in hearing what you have to say, is that if there is one casualty in the American cultural landscape, is that we have lost the capacity to read irony and to read under and double meanings. And you need an education, a small liberal arts education, to see that the author is telling you A, but you should understand B.
Yeah, I wrote a whole column a few weeks ago, maybe a few months ago, saying that we need immediately to deport all third-generation Americans, right? And Tucker Carlson, another imbecile, devoted an entire segment to denouncing this.
Right. So you did something like that in the New York Times, but you have often...
That's what a Trinity College education will do for you.
You have been accused, we were talking about it, as a man who cannot criticize Israel.
Yeah.
There are a number of worrisome elements from the Netanyahu government stopping alternative voices within Israel, yet Israel is a vigorous, versatile society. What is right with Israel and what is wrong with Israel?
Look, Israel is a democracy filled with human beings who screw up all the time. And its politics are not all that different from any other Western democracy, or democracy, Western or non-Western, in that they're susceptible to demagogy, the illiberal impulses to suppress views that are seen as heretical or antithetical to the Constitution of the state. We're having this very debate right now over Colin Kaepernick and our football players expressing. It's so funny that the same conservatives, by the way, same conservatives who are like, the campuses have become these places of total orthodoxy, right, where you can't express a dissenting view. Oh, the NFL must be a place where we express total orthodoxy because the flag is at stake. And you're like, sorry, I just...
Back to Israel.
Back to Israel, yeah. Where were we? So at any rate, so look, I mean, Israel is a highly... I was editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post for 3 years. It's a highly complex place, and there are all kinds of currents of illiberalism. There is, in my view, a excessive and destructive grip of the ultra-Orthodox on Israeli politics that affects everyday life, whether it's the question of marriage, praying at the Western Wall, any number of issues where maybe my deep secularism objects to the heavy influence of religion in the state. But Israel has to be judged, there's an old saying, I think Eric Hoffer said it, Israel is the only country in the world expected to be, of which people expect it to behave like a Christian nation, right? Israel conducts an operation in Gaza. The missile falls here as opposed to there. There's collateral damage. Well, that's a war crime, and there's a UN commission investigating. But nobody asks whether every British bomb that's been falling in Syria or Iraq has actually been hitting the target. When the United States accidentally bombs a hospital in Afghanistan, we say, well, gee, that was a really bad mistake, right? But I don't see a UN tribunal screaming at the top of its lungs, the United States Air Force must be brought before The Hague for its war crimes. So I guess the point I make about Israel is, yes, Israel should be judged. Israel should be judged toughly because it's a democracy that holds itself to a high ethical standard, right? But it should be judged normatively and not according to some weird idea that the Jewish state's entire legitimacy rests on the moral performance of any given individual within it. And look, say what you will about Israel. Go to haaretz.co.il and you will find criticism more scathing of the Israeli government, more scathing of Netanyahu on any given moment than anything you'll find here at Amherst or anywhere else. Tell me, where is the Haaretz of the Palestinian Authority? Where is the Haaretz of the government of Egypt? Where's the Haaretz in Saudi Arabia? Frankly, where's the Haaretz in the United States? Maybe the nation, not really. But I don't see any other country, certainly in that region, that allows gadflies to thrive in its society as vigorously and as openly as Israel does.
Why the nation not really?
Sorry?
Why the nation not really?
Because I think it's kind of dull.
Okay.
It's always the same Vanden Heuvel kind of warmed over quasi-Marxist critique.
Yeah.
It's no longer, I mean, I always love reading the left, right? And some of the best writing is on the left. And I find it's kind of, it feels like microwaved leftovers of thoughts first had in the 1970s. They were exciting, when it was ramparts back in the day, but they're less so now.
All right, one last question, Bret, and that has to do with Mexico and the wall, and it has to do with the response to the Puerto Rican crisis by the Trump administration. As a Mexican, or at least as an American who lived in Mexico, what is it that, what's your reaction to these aspects of the Latino-ness of the United States, which is close to being 20%, and the fact that in the Trump administration, people, at least to me, seem to not be getting any of this, seem to be having a very double standard in an approach that is paternalistic and xenophobic. But what your point? I'm not interested in mine. In yours, I'm interested in mine, but not now.
Look, I think the Trump administration's views and the statements on Mexico, the word despicable doesn't even begin to cover it. Every American, and especially non-Hispanic Americans, should get down on their hands and knees at least twice a day to thank God for having Mexico as our neighbor. Mexico is a fantastic neighbor to the United States. First of all, comparatively, if you're South Korea, your neighbor is North Korea. If you're Poland, your neighbor is Russia. If you're France, your neighbor is Germany. It's invaded you twice in the last 100 years, right?
Well, Mexico has been invaded by the United States.
Mexico, I'm not saying how they should pray.
Side, sure.
I think how we should pray, right?
Well, we've been invading the United States too.
Listen, Mexicans are wonderful, fantastic, amazing people. I mean, I think it's one of the most vibrant, incredible cultures. You can spend lifetimes in Mexico and not get to know the country fully. And for all of its problems, and nobody doubts the problems of a country with all the narcos and all the rest of it, we're blessed to have Mexicans as our neighbor. We're blessed to have Mexican Americans as our citizens. We should be opening our doors to more of them. And especially, and I make this case to people on the right, I'm like, oh, you're worried about the decline of Christianity in America. I mean, I'm not. I'm delighted by it, but they are. So who's filling pews in churches these days?
The Mexicans.
The Latinos are filling pews, evangelical pews or Catholic pews. You're worried about the demographic future of America because we don't want a Japan-style outcome where we just don't have a demography of young people to support an aging population. To whom do we have to thank for our comparatively robust demography that we are actually meeting the replacement rates? Latin America, right? And by the way, one of the things that I absolutely detest, and this goes to my core, is this idea, oh, we need high-quality immigration, right? We want those, French PhDs and German hygienists or whatever they do. No, actually, you want low-quality immigration because my mother came to this country as a displaced person and a refugee with $7. Okay? She was not high-quality immigration. And within one generation, her son is being accused by Tucker Carlson, the son of Ambassador Richard Carlson, right, that I'm the elitist. And I think, what a great country. That in one generation, the son of this refugee gets to be accused of being this out-of-touch elitist, This is the greatness of America, that it's the whole reason to love this country is that in a genuine way it allows, or it ought to allow, at its best it allows people to rise and rise from nothing and nowhere. And it's just not necessarily as true elsewhere. Nobody's really interested in what your dad did, and if your dad happened to be a rich guy, you're probably slightly ashamed of it. You're not going to mention it around here. What a difference between any other country where if you're, say, Chinese, you might mention that your father is the party chief leader in Chongqing or whatever, and things will go well for you. Not here.
We are open to for a dialogue. The microphone is here on my left, and if anybody is interested, please proceed. We need the microphone because we are taping this. So please go ahead.
You were talking about Bill Clinton paving the way for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. I think, look, although it now all seems extremely quaint given the scale of what is going on every week on any given day in Washington, Clinton, the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, had an illicit affair with an intern and then lied about it under a grand jury. And it wasn't, everyone says, oh, big deal, it was a blowjob, what is it? At any company you work for, if the CEO has an affair with a 20-year-old intern, he's going to be fired. And if he then goes and lies about it, it's going to be an even bigger problem. So I think that after Clinton, the consensus, somehow we reached a consensus in this country that character didn't really matter when it came to the presidency. What mattered was, quote, competence. And Bill Clinton was a very competent president. The U.S. economy thrived under his stewardship. So that was a Rubicon that was crossed, and somehow it, who you were as a person was no longer, if it was no longer a necessary, if not sufficient, consideration for your fitness for office. The second thing we said is, well, some kinds of lies are okay lies. You can lie about the blowjob, right? Because it's your personal business, whatever. Well, if one kind of lie is okay, well, why not Trump's lies? The crowds, this, that, and the other. Now we're all just sort of used to the fact that the President of the United States routinely lies about everything all the time in this kind of manic, nonstop way. Because we kind of define deviancy down under Clinton. Believe it or not, when Reagan was elected in 1980, it was considered vaguely scandalous that he'd been previously married, that he was on his second marriage. Now, obviously, I'm not advocating that we should go back to a standard where, a divorce ought to be disqualifying, but wouldn't it be nice if back in October of 2016, or when the Access Hollywood tape came out, more conservatives said, you know what, when Clinton was president, we said character counts. Well, character counts today, so we're not going to vote for this guy. We might not vote for Hillary, but we'll vote for Evan McMullin or whatever. It seems like a nice enough guy. So I think the left in this country is now paying a kind of price for having sort of created a culture in which we just said, well, some lies are just okay.
Anybody else? While we get the person to come, I have a question for you, Bret, and that is that it seems to me that among the many differences between... Oh, please, go ahead, and then I'll ask my question.
So my question is about U.S. foreign policy, and so after the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. has tried to step in and has framed its values as universal values and what some call American exceptionalism, and the notion that the U.S. leads the world as its values leader, let's say. So do you think Trump's move away from that? So Trump values sovereignty more than American universalism. Do you think that marks the end of post-Soviet Union American unipolarity?
You know, these landmarks in history are more easily recognized 10 or 20 years after the fact than when we're going through them now. But Trump's election represents, I think, an end to the era of what you might call the Harry Truman consensus, which was the idea that America does best when we define our interests according to our values as opposed to the other way around. Trump is a highly transactional, has a highly transactional view of foreign policy in which values like democracy, liberalism, human rights almost don't exist. And I think we're going to pay a very steep price for that. Like in 1948, there's this little enclave called West Berlin, and it is surrounded by the Soviet Union. And there are about 10 or 15,000 French, British, and American troops in this broken city. And Stalin decides that he's going to blockade the city and try to starve it into submission. And the question for Harry Truman, who was president at the time, was, well, what do you do? Because on the one hand, if you think of politics as purely transactional, maybe we could have traded West Berlin for some other concession on, say, Austrian neutrality or, you know, one thing or another. And secondly, our troops in West Berlin are in a militarily indefensible position, so why should we stake our credibility on defending a location that we couldn't defend if it came to war? Truman decides, no, there's a principle at stake here, and we are going to supply West Berlin through an airlift. And the airlift itself is a sort of inspiring story of logistics and all the rest of it. But think of what that airlift did, that example of putting our values before our immediate interests. Number one, it persuaded Germany, a country that had started 2 world wars in 50 years, that the United States was not only a benign but a benevolent power. I mean, what country rescues the capital city of the enemy it just defeated in one of the most brutal wars, if not the most brutal war in history? And so we turned Germans into a pro-American nation just through that. Secondly, it persuaded Italians, Norwegians, French, and others, the Belgians, that if we would go out on a limb for little West Berlin, that our security guarantees for the rest of Europe would be good. And so a year later, NATO comes into being, 1949, the Atlantic Alliance. But then 41 years later, in 1989, the Cold War ends. And where does it end? In Berlin. And why does it end? Because those people in East Berlin, being fed propaganda about oppressive capitalism and, you know, et cetera, could simply look over the wall and say, there in West Berlin, that free and thriving city, that's what we want for ourselves. And all we have to do is break down this wall. And so we ended up winning the greatest geopolitical contest of the 20th century without a single shot being fired and a single life being lost, because Truman had decided that values mattered more than interests, and we were going to stand up a little free society in that little sector smack in the middle of East Germany. Trump, I think, has abandoned that view. And I think we're going to pay consequences for it unless we kind of recover that instinct that America leads because people actually might want to follow us. Not because we have a larger economy or a bigger military, but because people think America, broadly speaking, is an admirable society filled with big-hearted people who are capable of generosity, including to people in far-flung corners of the world, whether it's in Korea or Lithuania or wherever. And I feel that if we lose that, we're going to return to a kind of a balance of power style of international politics that inevitably creates imbalances that lead to war.
Thank you.
In your book, the book that is available out there, called American Retreat, you had a very strong critique of the Obama administration. But as I heard somebody mention, you wrote the book One President Too Soon.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like my critique of the Obama administration is being much too reticent in the use of American power and having this idea that foreign policy and domestic policy, to some extent, are in tension with one another. That phrase of Obama's, nation building at home, the idea that when we invest abroad, we're losing out on what we can invest at home. All of that seems almost quaint next to the kind of, isolationism on crack
that Trump has. Yes.
So when you spoke earlier about how you think that the majority of people here would probably not be affected by the administration directly, it got me thinking about the potential repeal of the ACA. And so I interpreted that as maybe you're pretty confident that it won't be repealed, but I was just curious about your thoughts on that.
In any administration, stuff happens, right? One way or the other. So yes, in some large way, everyone gets affected. And of course, we're all affected because, just the other day in Australia, it was on a TV show, and they turned to a clip of Trump speaking at a rally in Alabama, and I was sitting there watching and just cringing that this guy is my president and I'm an American. I just wanted to bury my head in shame. But look, what I mean is that except at the margins of American life, and those margins include lots of people, don't get me wrong, but except at the margins of American life, even a Trump will not have the kind of effect on the lives of most Americans that, say, the draft did in 1967, where you got a bad draft number and there was a good chance you were going to end up in some godforsaken outpost on the DMZ in Vietnam. I only meant it in a comparative sense. I don't want to drive that point too far and suggest that Trump is meaningless. But believe me, if you went back 15 years, people would be saying, the Bush administration changes everything, or this is a disaster. And now I hear the right saying, America, if you listen to Sean Hannity or these guys, right, the picture they paint of America under Obama was one nonstop nightmare. And I wanted to say to them, really? And I was a critic of Obama, but where is this Holocaust taking place under Obama? That when Trump gave his inaugural address, he talked about American carnage. Remember that? The Battle of Gettysburg was carnage, right? There was carnage at Selma during the Civil Rights movement. Where was the American carnage that he was speaking about? So Americans often have a way of speaking histrionically about politics that's out of keeping with the impact of politics on their personal lives.
But let me make a plea here, Bret. I am very concerned about many other things about my DACA students. They are as integral and not marginal in my classroom
Absolutely.
As anybody else. And if 800,000 young men and women are going to be deported, all of us are going to be lost.
It's one of the greatest disgraces of in a long time. So look, I'm sorry, I don't want to, maybe I should rethink the comment. What I meant was in a fairly narrow ambit of largely privileged young people who have the benefit of being enrolled at Amherst College or living in its environs. But something like DACA, 800,000 people living in this limbo in which, even if they aren't deported, run all kinds of risks in terms of their job tenure, in terms of their college prospects, one thing or another. Those have real effects.
Again, I understand, and I really don't want to, but the perception that small colleges like this are only made of privilege, when in the past 20 years there has been a great advance in bringing other groups into the classroom, into the campus, that do not come from privilege. I believe in the many wonderful things that you've said today, that sometimes the perception of how black and white or single-sided colleges are, there is dissent, there is a no, there are people who here come whose parents are janitors who might tomorrow be facing an FBI officer with a warrant telling them that they can't be in the classroom. We have very many different types of students.
I don't doubt that for a second. You're absolutely right. And maybe the comment comes from the fact that I spent almost all day yesterday in Hunts Point, the Bronx, which is the poorest zip code in America. And so maybe the experience of moving from Hunts Point on Wednesday to Amherst College gives me an exaggerated sense of the privilege, and I mean that in the best sense, of attending a school as beautiful and as marvelously endowed as this one is.
Do you want to?
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a question here. Go ahead. You can. I can translate.
That they're going to get here and at other fine institutions will make them good citizens. But the effect on them, they are going to be going out into the workplace. They are going to be living under whatever, at this point, the Republican Party and Trump and the Supreme Court decide is the way that they should live. No possibility of abortion, maybe take away birth control, all sorts of things, human rights and the right to not have religion or have religion. These are the people that are going to suffer. We're the older ones, we're going to get under the line, but they're not. And we have grandchildren and children that are going to be facing these terrible things. So I don't feel like we're getting away, or these students are getting away with anything. They're the ones that are going to have to stand up and fight back, because their lives are going to be much different than ours. We were the generation after the war. We had the good life. They're not going to have it.
Well, I agree, and that's one of the reasons why when we think about an administration that is as utterly distressing is too weak a word, appalling as this one is, it's important to care about it quite passionately. It's also important to care about it intelligently, because on current course, Trump is going to win re-election. And all of you who are imagining that he's going to be impeached any moment now, I think, in my view, are probably engaged in wishful thinking. Just as many of us, and I include myself in this comment, were engaged in wishful thinking when we said he cannot possibly win. It's going to be the biggest blowout in history. But that failure is also our failure to understand the country we were living in and to engage in a smart way with the persuadables who ended up voting for him, because they thought they would just take a gamble on a guy who promised to shake up a system that they didn't like. And we were too complacent about that system. And I think if we had been less complacent, if we had been more willing to say, there are real problems in this country which the Obama administration has not addressed, right? And there is a reason why if you will, liberal progressive America grates on a great many Americans who aren't just sort of knee-jerk bigots, right? If we'd been able to do that and had a candidate who could have articulated that, rather than run as a I deserve this, it's my turn candidate, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd be talking about anything but this, right? So, I mean, this goes back to what we were saying earlier. I think a failure intellectually, and I include myself in this, to engage in a serious way with the kind of the nub of the Trumpist complaint really hurt us. You know, whenever you're in an argument and you're screamingly angry about something, you know, and your partner says, you're hysterical, you know, my wife says this to me all the time, right? Yeah, I am, and I'm not expressing myself, but somewhere in there, there's a point that I'm just not quite getting out. And I feel that somewhere within the Trump vote, there was a point that wasn't quite getting out. And you can say it was stagnant wages. You could say it was a genuine and not entirely unbased fear of kind of culture shifts that they were having trouble, to which they were having trouble adjusting. One thing or another, that was there in that primal scream of the vote. And many of us in Manhattan or Amherst or wherever just said, you're just screaming, just shut up. We shouldn't make that mistake again.
We're going to have 3 more questions and we're going to conclude. There are 3 speakers here.
As another Latin Jew, it's cool to see other ones, so that's nice.
My God, 3 of us.
Far too many, in my opinion. But, no, I have a question, and I don't want to harp on this, but you were talking about how liberals open themselves up to lack of character in the presidency with Clinton, and I'm just wondering how that is. Did we ever have presidents? Did we ever really care that much about presidents with character? I think back to Jefferson having one of his friends call Adams a hermaphrodite. I'm thinking back to Nixon, who was a paranoid maniac. I'm thinking back to a lot of presidents in the past who it would be, Lyndon B. Johnson even, very difficult to call men of character. So I'm just wondering why Clinton, in your mind, is this like epochal shift?
I don't think it was an epochal shift, but I think it was a shift. And look, one thing that differed was, yeah, Lyndon Johnson was a despicable person. If Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, he probably would have been the first vice president thrown out because of financial shenanigans. But he pretended. He knew enough to pretend to be ethical. Even Nixon wanted to present himself as a highly ethical figure. So character isn't necessarily what we now know historically after the fact about the way these guys were. It's how we perceive them at the time as upholding a certain set of standards. I mean, I'll tell you, this is a true story, which moved me deeply. It comes from a friend of mine who was a White House reporter during the Obama years. And Obama was a big reader. You know, Obama was clearly a smart, thoughtful guy. Goes on vacation to Hawaii. And, you know, the reporter pools love being in Hawaii, and all you have to do is cover, you know, get a distant shot of the president playing golf or whatever. And so at some point, this reporter I know asked the president, he said, so what do you read over the vacation? And he mentioned like a couple of like potboiler novels. Nothing to be ashamed of, just normal things that normal people read when they're on vacation and they want to turn their brain off. So he gets on Air Force One, and a press flat comes out and says, these are the books the president read on vacation. And they're all like heavy tomes of, you know, 600-page volumes of serious literature. And my friend knew, well, that's bullshit. He just read a couple potboilers, right? But what was the interesting point of this anecdote was they wanted to create the impression that the president used his free time to, you know, immerse himself in, I don't know, mid-19th century economic history or whatever it was. And I think that was terrific. It was trying to maintain the image of the president as a guy who's sort of thinking deeply about, the eternal verities at all time. Do I think Obama had a bad character for reading those potboilers? No, but there was an effort to say that, the president at all times presents himself in a certain way. God knows who we all are in our personal life. And I say this like as a guy who was critical of Obama as president. Whenever Obama, say, presided over a Medal of Honor ceremony or whenever he was meeting foreign leaders, I thought, he's my president. He rose to the dignity of the office in a public way. And that's what I'm talking about. I guess what I should be, to be more specific, is public character or political character, if you will. What these guys are like in their private life is another story.
Just a quick follow-up. But when Clinton was elected, he failed in upholding this idealized version of the presidency, but he wasn't elected with the knowledge that he was going to do that. So I don't see how liberals open themselves up.
Well, when he was elected, the big story about Clinton was his serial affairs with various people. And that was a kind of moment because you had George H.W. Bush as this classic Republican establishment figure with an admirable war record who had, George H.W. Bush as a fine kind of upstanding guy, right? And Clinton came in, and everyone knew about Jennifer Flowers, and I don't know if we knew about Paula Jones then, but these were allegations that had trailed him, and the country seemed to be making a conscious choice that this guy was smart, he was dynamic, and yes, there were some below the waistline issues with the guy, but surely those would sort of be put aside as president, and they weren't. And I mean, look, I'm not going to stake my intellectual reputation on this claim, but I think that was a moment where we said, okay, big deal, this doesn't matter. And I think we're living with the consequences of it in a bigger way now because we've suddenly normalized behavior that 30 years ago, anyone who's older in this room knows would not have flown. Donald Trump would not have been elected president in 1976.
Thank you.
Great. Next one.
So you mentioned earlier that you had left the Republican Party recently. I myself left the Democratic Party earlier this year. And I guess I wanted to ask, sort of independent to independent, given this, you alluded to kind of Duverger's law with the bipolarity of the system. Are we living in this period of just kind of ad infinitum, Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump, further and further to the extremes on both sides, or is this a flash in the pan and we're going to see a return?
My hope is that Macronism might be in our future. I mean, what I mean by that is we're living in an era of weak parties. You just saw over the weekend the AfD, this populist is too weak a word, almost fascistic right-wing party, become the third party in Germany, which is incredible. In France, both the traditional leading parties, the Gaullists and then the socialists, didn't get into the second round of the election. In Britain, you have a very weak Tory party facing a Labour Party that's in a kind of its own transformation into something very different from what you had 10 or so years ago. And so the United States, I think something similar is occurring in that the party system is no longer producing people that I think normal people think are, want to vote for. And so there's an opportunity for those of us who are independents to say, why don't we have a party of people who think for themselves and who don't necessarily stick with every single goddamn orthodoxy, if I may say so. Of either, Republicans who think that you have a right to, walk around with M16s, in all places at all times, and, Democrats who, think that what we need to do is have Medicare for all, damn the expenses, So, and I think, there are people who actually have normal thoughts and, are sort of inherently balanced people. And we've created a system in which those people don't want to be in government, or they are fringe voices in their own party. We've created a system where the fringe is now the center, and the center has become the fringe. Right. And I think that's kind of tragic for our republic, if you will. America is filled with normal, moderate people who are capable of holding conversations and being ambivalent about any number of issues. And ambivalence is a virtue. You should be able to say, I'm not sure. I don't know. I can see both sides of that argument. I guess I kind of fall down a little bit here and a little bit there, but I accept that there's another point of view. And wouldn't it be amazing if we had a political system in which more of those people were actually represented in Congress, as opposed to the freak show that we're getting now? Trump is just the beginning. I mean, this goes back to your earlier point. I think we're going to get more of this unless something changes.
Thank you.
One last.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
So as probably the only person in this room that voted for Donald Trump,
Awesome.
I appreciate your criticisms of him, for sure. And I appreciate you presenting the argument why somebody might have reasonably voted for him on the basis of policies rather than his character. And I do understand your criticisms of his character, believe me. But I want to touch a little bit about the foreign policy comment you made. I understand why you think he's an extreme isolationist because of the campaign rhetoric, but do you really still think he is with the bombing in Syria, with the intervention with giving Japan more access to defending themselves against North Korea and South Korea, and now we see what's going on in the Middle East?
Yeah, the word isolationism isn't a doctrine per se. It's an instinct. And at the heart of the isolationist instinct is whatever we do abroad takes away from what we have at home, and other people should go and solve their own problems. We've got enough of our own. And so the word is sometimes used too broadly. And is Trump an isolationist, or is he a kind of a nationalist with isolationist instincts? I think it's too soon to say. But the guy who, and I supported his attack on Syria as punishment for the use of chemical weapons, but he's essentially accepted that Bashar Assad is going to remain in power in Syria, despite his war crimes, and despite being an arm and an extension of Iranian power in the Middle East. So irrespective of that one-off strike, he's followed the Obama policy on Syria. And I think we're going to live with the consequences of that in the Middle East for a long time. We'll see about what happens in North Korea, but so far, we have a policy of, talk loudly and carry a small stick. I don't know what's going to happen, but I think the president is getting rather over his skis on North Korea in a way that frightens me. But I have to tell you, I can't tell you how much I admire you for saying this. And I mean that in all sincerity. Because I know a lot of very smart people who voted for Trump. And I know how difficult it is to actually say that, probably, I suspect, in a room where you are maybe the only person here who...
I don't go here. Go to Mount Holyoke.
I
don't care what you guys say.
But I think it matters, and I think even it behooves us, as angry I am about so much that Trump has done, and outraged I am by his behavior, I am trying inside to say to myself, there's an intelligent supporter on the other side, and that's the person I want to engage. Because it's too easy to go after all the dumb stuff that Trump does day in and day out. The harder task and the more interesting task is to say, okay, let's take the smartest possible defense of Trump, and let's focus on that. What is that argument? And if I can understand it, maybe I can demolish it and persuade you that, no, I made a bad choice back in November. I don't know if I can do that, but if I could do that, I'd feel much happier than simply kind of summoning applause and authority by finding colorful ways to talk about what a jerk he is. And I think we have to do that all the time in almost all the conversations that we have. When I was on Bill Maher the other day, I said something like, we don't have a presidency, we have a neurosis. And I got this huge applause from the audience, and it was retweeted 1 billion times or whatever. And afterwards I said, God, that was such an easy line. It was an easy line. But Bill Maher said, what is it about liberals that drives people crazy? And there I said, the real problem is cultural condescension. And I'm more pleased for having been kind of hissed at for saying that than I am for the easy applause line with Trump.
Let me wrap this up. I want to salute you as well. Happy that you came from Mount Holyoke, and happy that you're speaking your voice.
You're at Mount Holyoke?
I'm a senior at Mount Holyoke.
My sister went there. Good school.
I'm going to wrap this up, Bret. Before we concluded, I want to remind everybody that the books America in Retreat by Bret Stephens are available outside, thanks to Amherst Books, and he is going to sign some books before he goes back to New York. I want to ask you one more question to wrap this up.
Okay.
We are the difference between Obama and Trump are so many, the differences, but one is dramatic to me, and that is the difference of the English language.
Yes.
Any remarks as a person that is so careful about building his sentences orally and in the written form, as you are, on the way our leaders directly or indirectly shape the English language through pronouncements, through easy conversation, or they don't?
No, I mean, it's one of the... I mean, it's funny that you should say this because it seems like such a small point, but it matters, and it's ironic that a president who resents the fact that you should have to, press 1 for English can't speak it. Trump is, look, reflections, I think he reflects a culture of low literacy. We have a president, I mentioned Obama claiming, or Obama's handlers claiming he read all these big books, but at least Obama read some books, right? Trump hasn't read a book in 45 years by his own admission. I would be astounded if Trump actually read Art of the Deal.
The book he wrote. The book supposedly.
He ghost wrote, right? Or that was ghost written for him. George Orwell in Politics in the English Language makes this wonderful point. He says, our slovenly thoughts lead to slovenly language, but I'm not quite quoting him precisely, but it works in the opposite direction. And I think we're suffering from that, and it's especially acute because this slovenly language is now being put to use, making pronouncements about, say, a crisis as delicate as North Korea. My little girl, my 8-year-old daughter, has a T-shirt she loves. It's punctuation saves lives. Let's eat, comma, grandma, as opposed to let's eat grandma. And this is a risk that we now run in geopolitics as well. Look, I guess what I'll say is, to conclude, is beyond the whole open-minded business, it's so important to cultivate habits of thoughtfulness. And one of the best ways of doing it isn't simply in the spoken word, but in the written word, and really taking the time to shape what it is that you really mean to say. One of the reasons I hate being on television is that sometimes you're on TV and someone asks you something and you answer it, and then you think, did I really mean that? But one of the joys of being a writer is you get to say exactly what you mean. I hope all of you also, I'm sure all of you also cultivate this. It's very important that we still retain a capacity for clear, precise thought and an understanding of how difficult it is to write sentences which are clear and precise. That helps, I think that helps the culture, it helps the country when our thoughts are clear and we arrive at them through some strenuous process as opposed to what we have now.
Bret, it has been wonderful to spend the day with you and to have you here in front of the audience.
Thank you very much.
Muchísimas
Very nice.